Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
May is Lyme Disease Awareness Month, and with climate change, the warm weather could increase the incidence from the tick that carries the disease. You're listening to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Here on the shore, the Lyme Disease Association of Delmarva is marking its 20th anniversary, and in our studio this afternoon is Pam Andrews. She is president of the organization and a former program director for WSDO. Welcome back.
Thank you. Many years ago that was, it seems, yes.
So let me just start out with your own personal experience. I mean, how did you become aware that you had the disease? What kind of symptoms were there? What was that experience like?
Well, I did not start off life wanting to do anything with medicine or Lyme disease. This really was not my wheelhouse, and I wasn't interested. But my youngest daughter came down with the flu in the middle of summer when nobody else had flu, and she was just horribly sick for 3 weeks. Vomiting, diarrhea, high fevers. We took her to the hospital. We called her doctor, and he just couldn't figure out what was going on. And the doctor scolded me and said, "Don't be hysterical, it's just the flu." Well, as it turns out, she never did get better from that. She got better over the acute phase of that, but she never got over having Lyme disease, which took us another 9 years to figure out. 9 years, 13 doctors, 3 medical institutions. Later, we finally found someone who did a Lyme test on her. And the issue is that if you aren't looking for Lyme disease, you're not going to find it. And nobody was looking for Lyme disease. This was back in 1991. So we finally found a doctor who determined she had Lyme disease and started treatment, which was just amazing because there is such a thing as the Herxheimer reaction, which means when you start taking medicines and all that bacteria from the Lyme disease dies off, it makes you sicker for a while. So she was bedridden for a few years while we were going through that. It was only through working with her that I discovered that I too had Lyme disease, because I noticed that I did have some of the same symptoms that she did.
So what was your experience then like? I mean, and how did it compare with what your daughter was going through?
Well, my daughter probably got Lyme disease from tick bites. She went over with friends to Assateague and spent many afternoons over there in the sand, the beach, the grasses and everything over there, and there definitely is Lyme disease along that area there. Mine was much more subtle. I think that sometimes what happens is if you get infected and you have a good immune system, then you don't even pick up on the fact that you are perhaps not operating at best until something else happens in your life. Either you get another disease that knocks down your immune system, you go through some kind of trauma like a divorce or the death of a family member. And when your immune system is suppressed, and for me, it have been taking care of her for all those years when she was in that heavy-duty treatment, then my immune system took a dive, and I finally asked her Lyme doctor to have a test done on me, and my Western blot also came back with a positive.
Because one of the things that I was reading is that trying to diagnose Lyme disease, that the symptoms tend to be non-specific, that you could have something to, say, arise that might be a number of different things or even a couple of things, and they're kind of searching around, and if Lyme is obviously not at the top of the list or they're not checking for it, you might go for a long time without
That's exactly right, because Lyme disease is caused by a bacteria called a spirochete, and it's sort of a corkscrew shape, and that can go just about anywhere in your body. It can go in the tissue, the muscles, the blood, the brain. It can go anywhere. And since it can go anywhere and infect anywhere, it can cause just about any symptom. So they call it the great mimicking disease. It's sort of like syphilis in a way. They said that syphilis mimics so many disease. Well, syphilis actually is a spirochete just like Lyme disease. Although the Lyme disease spirochete has a much more complex genetic makeup and can really do things that syphilis can't do. So, yes, you're right. It can go anywhere and create just about any symptom, which makes it very difficult to diagnose.
So if it goes untreated, say, for example, is it that at one point you may simply die from it? I
Yes.
mean, is that right?
Yes, you can. It can do things like get into the heart muscles, and actually that doesn't have to take years and years and years to have that happen. It's just a matter of that's where it decided to go. I think I've heard some Lyme doctors say that many times the spirochetes might go to where you may have had an injury before. If you like played tennis and you hurt your knee, it may be even more likely that it will set up shop in your knee, for instance, or an ankle or somewhere where you've had an injury previously. But it can really go anywhere.
So there's been a great deal of controversy about tests. I guess there's some tests that test for, say, antibodies, and sometimes they're not accurate. What do we know about the tests? Particularly, you've been looking at this thing for the last 20 years. Obviously, a lot of things have changed. What is the sense that you get about where we are with that?
Unfortunately, this is a very controversial area. The Infectious Disease Society of America, which we kind of collapse into the IDSA. The IDSA has, over the years, over the 30 years or so that I've been dealing with this, changed very little in their outlook on how to diagnose and treat Lyme disease. This in the face of research that has made progress in how we test and treat Lyme disease. The testing is really an issue. Back when I was tested for the first time, the test that was usually used was called the ELISA test. We know that test now is very inaccurate. And with it being so inaccurate, you might as well flip a coin because it's almost around that 50% accurate. So that really is a very bad test. There's a Western blot test, which is somewhat more accurate. Ironically, though, some doctors have found that the sicker the patient is, sometimes that means they won't get a good test or an accurate test. And the reason for that is that many of the tests depend on the body's reaction. They're looking for signs of what is going on in your body to test whether you have Lyme disease. And if you're too sick to mount a reaction, then the test won't be accurate. Now, there are other tests that actually grow the spirochetes, and by doing that, you get a much more accurate test because you're actually looking for the bacteria, not for your body's reaction to the bacteria. The only problem is that those tests are expensive, and so your insurance companies don't want to pay for those. They take longer too. It's not like you send it off and a week later it comes back. You have to have time to actually grow the bacteria in the test tubes.
Now, one of the things that you see a lot particularly if you surf the net, I guess it is, that there's this sort of recommended heavy dose of antibiotics over like 2 or 3 weeks if you found to have it and you catch it early, or longer regimen if you, for instance, have had it for a longer period of time. What about that approach?
We find that the folks who suspect right away that they have Lyme disease, if you treat them right away with adequate doses of antibiotics, that can help tremendously so that they don't go into having a really chronic Lyme disease situation. It's a matter of when you first get bit, the spirochetes are sort of right there at the right at the surface, and that's why the antibiotics can really get to them. If you wait a week, a month, or sometimes years before people figure out that maybe they've been exposed to Lyme disease, then the bacteria has disseminated throughout your whole body. That's when it really doesn't work to do just a short term of antibiotics. I'm referring to the work of Dr. Ying Zhang with the Bloomberg School of Medicine in Baltimore, with it's a branch of Johns Hopkins. His work was very interesting because he took various antibiotics and tested them to see what would happen when these bacteria were exposed to the antibiotics. The antibiotic that's mostly used is doxycycline, and he found that doxycycline can actually make Lyme disease worse, because when you take the doxycycline, the spirochetes have the ability to ball up into a cyst, and they stay in that cyst where they are no longer, the antibiotics can't kill them anymore. And then when you stop taking antibiotics, those cysts open up and several spirochetes come out. So you're actually making the disease worse. And I know that sounds counterintuitive.
Yeah.
The way to deal with that, perhaps, is, according to Dr. Zhang's research, is that you use more than one antibiotic. There's a series of antibiotics that you use together. He also tested out some of the herbals, like oregano oil and some of the other herbals that are well known for being able to kill bacteria. And he found that those sometimes work just as well, which is shocking. But I'm ready to go wherever the science takes us. So if that's what works, then that's good.
So is that just about as far as we are in terms of like trying to find a cure? If quite a cure is quite the right word to use, because I mean it sounds as if you get this, and you might have the antibiotic, may do all these things, and yet you still will have these lingering effects.
There are a number of research projects going on to see what else can kill these spirochetes. And I probably shouldn't speak about them because some of them are still in the active phase of being evaluated. And, I don't want to come across as recommending something before we actually find that it does work. But there are any number of research projects going on that are looking at many other ways of killing these bacteria.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago, by the way, insurance companies, that they can refuse to, say, pay for some of the costs in terms of trying to treat it. Tell me a little bit about that, your own personal experience or the experience of others.
This is huge. It's huge because since the insurance companies will not pay for having the testing nor the treatment, then you run into problems with having things get worse because you can't afford. And through our meetings, we've had monthly meetings since 2003 when we first started this organization. And time again, I talked with families who could not afford to have their family members treated because it was so expensive. And the reason it was so expensive was because the insurance companies wouldn't do their part in helping to pay for it. So it's not only the testing, but as I've mentioned before, just a very limited course of antibiotics does not kill the Lyme disease. As a matter of fact, many times the bacteria of the Lyme disease and the co-infections like Bartonella and Babesia set up shop in biofilms in your body. And that's like a little hotel where all these pathogens can kind of work together to protect themselves.
Is there a sense do you get that that you will be able to find some kind of way to approach this medically to perhaps ultimately eliminate this from one's body, or are there lingering effects in the sense of, okay, you get it and you may even be cured, right? But there's still lingering effects. I mean, we see that, for instance, with COVID as a good example where you have this sort of long haul thing. Is that part of the scenario here?
Yes, it is, because there is chronic Lyme disease. And don't let anybody tell you there is no such thing as chronic Lyme disease. I am living proof of that, and I have evidence to prove it. However, when we look at Lyme disease and making it go away completely, I will give you a for instance of one of my family members who had it for so very long before she was diagnosed. Her doctor told her she would have organ damage from going 9 years without any treatment. And, the spirochetes just living in her body, going wherever they chose for 9 years. And she does suffer the effects of long-term organ damage. However, that said, I do believe if we can find a way of treating this much more effectively, that we possibly can get to the place where folks who have chronic Lyme disease can be cured. That's what I'm hoping for.
Now, the other thing, by the way, I was reading about was the potential for vaccines. I understand that Moderna, for instance, announced that it's working on at least 2 Lyme disease vaccines. Meanwhile, a joint effort by Pfizer and a French company say they plan to submit an application to the Food and Drug Administration by 2025. Are you optimistic about that at all? And I mean, obviously, particularly kind of going through COVID, we have a whole new set of ways now to produce vaccines.
Well, for Lyme patients, the vaccines do kind of come with a little bit of a bad feeling, and that's because there was a vaccine before, I believe, by SmithKline.
Right, there was an earlier one, yes.
Right, and it made people sick.
Right.
So, and I don't know that I could say it gave them Lyme disease, but it gave them Lyme-like symptoms. That said, I would be delighted if there were a vaccine that would take away the experience of going out, going for a walk in the woods, and coming back with ticks on you and you get Lyme disease. It's horrible. What even makes that worse, of course, is the global warming. We are having more ticks now than ever.
I was going to ask you about that because, when I can remember in my younger days, it was many years ago, go out to the woods. We were in California, so we went out to redwoods, that kind of thing. Never really thought anything about this, even though there was some potential for bad diseases out there. But it does seem as if this sort of curbs one's enthusiasm for going out into the wild.
Yes, and in doing that, what we need to consider is being sure that you have used permethrin on your clothing, not on your skin, but on your clothing, and wearing light colors, being sure you have shoes and socks on, so that if you get ticks, you see them. And when you get back, take your clothes off. I know one specialist who says that she puts her clothing, all of it, out on her black top driveway to kill the ticks, or put them in the dryer at a high temperature. That kills the ticks. Don't just go into your house and take them off and put them in, your laundry basket, because the ticks may be on the clothing and just stay in the house and get on you anyhow. And another thing you should be very careful about is your pets, to be sure that if they go outside, they have the proper protection against having ticks stay on them, and that you do examine them too.
And as I said, I think dogs, for instance, they have a vaccine for, right?
I believe they do. But, people aren't dogs. And one of the times when I was testifying before the state of Maryland legislatures, one of the senators, I believe it was saying, well, why don't we just use the dog vaccine on humans? Well, the blood of a dog and a human are not exactly the same, and unfortunately, that doesn't work.
So what's in terms of your own prognosis? Something you do sort of live with then in the years to come?
I fight it constantly. I am not on antibiotics, but there are several other ways to deal with Lyme disease. Some of it is trying to maintain a very healthy lifestyle. For instance, I do try to eat healthy for the most part, occasional birthday cake or something like that to aside. Just getting enough sleep, being very kind to yourself. The overall health is a big deal.
Sort of have to be very careful, I guess, about how you live.
Yes. And, I would be very hesitant to have much in the way of a cocktail or any alcohol at all. And, that doesn't make a big difference in my life. But there are times when maybe you'd like to have a glass of champagne to celebrate something, and, oh, well.
Well, a little soda or something, I guess.
That's right. You substitute where you have to.
Well, we were speaking with Pam Andrews. She is president of the Lyme Disease Association of Delmarva, also a former program director for WSDO. Appreciate you stopping by and chatting with us.
My pleasure.
You're listening to Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.